So we're about 3 weeks out from the beginning of the preseason, starting with a golf tournament, physicals, first few practices, preseason games, the whole spiel. And I thought it was about time we looked at the Metropolitan at the Atlantic Division. First, I'm going to look at the Atlantic, starting with the first two teams right here and now on Puck Talk Montreal. Now, of course, when I say the first two teams, I don't mean the top two teams in the division. I never go in that direction. I always start with the teams I think the Canadiens should have had an easy time with, didn't, and should move forward from there. Now, granted, the Canadiens didn't play poorly against the Atlantic Division last year, and they only had a handful of difficult games against the competition. But by and large, the Atlantic Division is considered by many to be the most difficult division in hockey. The Metropolitan, the weakest. So that's why I'm looking at the Metropolitan first, because if the Canadiens can make the playoffs as one of the top three teams, or four, depending on where they end up, if they get a wild card spot, if they can end up there, then I think the Canadiens will be in good shape, because you get through the first couple of rounds, you get to the conference final, the Metro's not too strong, and lo and behold, you've got a shot. Not to pump up everybody's tires, but that's theoretically how it goes. So let's take a look at the first two teams that I want to talk about. But first, let's take a look at the standings as a whole for the division last year. And as you can see, the Leafs, of course, on top, followed by the Lightning, Panthers, Senators, the Habs, finishing in fifth place in the Atlantic Division. Then you've got the Red Wings, Sabres, and Bruins. The Red Wings, of course, finishing 5 points behind the Canadiens. And really, it was just the Blue Jackets that were really close to the Canadiens as far as getting them out of a playoff spot. And now when you think about all that, the first two teams I want to look at are, of course, our arch nemesis, the Boston Bruins, and a team we play primarily on Friday nights that I hate so much I can't even begin to explain it, the Buffalo Sabres. So let's take a look at what the Bruins have done during the offseason so far. This is a list of all the signings the Bruins have made since the end of the season. So you've got Mason Laurie, Kuznetsov, Geeky, Jokiharju, Beecher, DiPietro, Janot, Corrali, Esamont, Steves, Harris, and Blumel. All those guys signed to 1 or 2 year contracts, with the exception of Tanner Janot, which everybody is like, holy hell, what were the Bruins thinking? Signing him at 5 years, $3.4 million on July 1st. I mean, it's kind of like, the Bruins are going through, you could call it what it is. It's a rebuild, right? And so they're going to be signing guys that they may very well keep long-term based on the style of play that they want. So that's where Janot comes in. Everybody was really high on Janot last season, but he didn't pan out the way they wanted. The Bruins just decided, you know what, the hell with it. We're going to do what we want and get him anyway. And when you look at the rest of the names on this list, right, it's not like there's a lot of guys here that are going to break the bank. Jordan Harris at $825, I mean, seriously, that's a steal, in my opinion. Jordan Harris is going to be a good defenseman. Didn't really get a fair shake in Columbus, but he's going to be a good defenseman. Sean Corrali, of course. Esamont, I loved last season when I watched him play. And so there are some good pieces here for the Bruins to work with. Then when you look at the moves they made, they got Victor Arvidsson from the Oilers for their 2027 fifth-round pick. And then they also got Victor Soderstrom from the Blackhawks for Ryan Mast and a 2025 seventh-round pick. Interesting. Arvidsson, a little long in the tooth. It doesn't really look like the Bruins are looking to compete all that much. In fact, it looks more like they're looking to tank than it is to compete. But I wouldn't call it tanking, because they are, after all, the Boston Bruins. And the Bruins aren't known for a team that wants to tank. They do want to get a high draft pick. The draft is extremely deep this coming year, with Gavin McKenna being the projected first overall. So the Bruins want to be in good position to be able to get a good draft pick to help kickstart their rebuild, much like the Canadiens did with Juraj Slafkovsky. Now, here's the thing. When you look at the Bruins roster as a whole, right, what you're going to get is the following. And this is according to Puckpedia, of course. You get Geeky with Lindholm and Pastrnak, Middlestad, Zaka, and Arvidsson, Janot, Corrali, Poitras, Esemont on the fourth with Beecher and Kastelik. On defense, Lindholm, McAvoy, Zadorov, Yokiharu, Laurie, and Peaky. And of course, in goal, you got Swayman and Korpisalo. Now, here's the thing as I look at this when I'm trying to assess the Bruins. When I look at them in goal, Swayman didn't have a good year last year. He can be better. But their defense with Lindholm, McAvoy, Zadorov, Yokiharu, those four are a solid top four on any team. So why wouldn't the Bruins, build from the back end up? It's a little bit of a jump start on their part. Whereas the Canadiens didn't have much in the pipeline, didn't have much as far as guys that were young to be able to come forward. They had to stockpile draft picks, pick players, bring them in. The Ghoulies of the world. Yes, Arbor Jacki was a walk-on, but you've got Struble, Caden Gooley, Lane Hudson. The list goes on and on. Of course, you've got David Reinbacher also coming up now, going to be in the NHL sooner rather than later. So there's a lot of depth there from the Canadiens, but they had to build it over time. Right now, if you look at the Bruins, they don't have to build anything. That back end is more than decent. And with quality goaltending from Swayman, their goals against is going to be much better than what it was last year. Then you look at the forwards, and there's a little bit to be desired there. Obviously, both Zaka and Middlestad have been discussed as trade pieces in the summer for the Bruins, but nothing's come from that. Tanner Janot, of course, just got picked up. SMA as well. So, the forward group is a little bit in flux, and that is where the Bruins are going to have to build a little bit. How competitive they're going to be, that's going to depend primarily on Pastrnak. I think the biggest thing about the Bruins is the fact that they didn't bother to bring back Brad Marchand, and they spent that money on Janot. That's where everybody's really freaked out about the Bruins. But by and large, even with that move and even with everything that's gone on as far as signings for the Bruins, the biggest question mark for them is their coaching. After what happened to Jim Montgomery when he was unceremoniously let go because they won the President's Trophy and then lost in the first round, I don't think there's a person in the National Hockey League that foresaw that happening. And why Don Sweeney and Cam Neely decided to do that is beyond me, because Jim Montgomery, as he's shown with the St. Louis Blues, is an extremely good coach. So the Bruins are bringing in Marco Sturm. Marco Sturm has an excellent track record wherever he's gone as far as coaching is concerned, and he was a very well-respected NHLer in his day as well. So adding Sturm as the head coach to bring stability behind the bench is a smart move by the Boston Bruins. Now, whether or not it's going to translate to victories remains to be seen. But when you look at the head-to-head against the Canadiens lost 2 of 3 meetings against the Bruins last year. And why did they do that? Well, number one, our goaltending was not good. The save percentage for our goaltenders against the Bruins, and they played them once in October, once in December, and once, of course, towards the tail end of the season on April 3rd, when the Canadiens got their only win against the Bruins. Our save percentage was .856, whereas the Bruins, not much greater, was at .876. So where's the big difference as far as the Canadiens are concerned? When you look at the face-off circle, they were almost at 50%. Through the 3 games, the Canadiens were 49.48. So we're not going to blame it on face-offs because it's 50-50 basically. One of the things you can definitely blame the losses on is the Canadiens' inability to score on the power play. It was expected from the Bruins given the Bruins roster, right? But the Canadiens went 1 for 9 on the power play against the Bruins. That's 11.1% in 3 games. The way that broke down is they had 6 power play opportunities in their first game in October, 2 in their second in December, and then 1 in their third. So they went 1 for 6 in that first game in October, and that was it. And the Bruins, they weren't much better. They went 1 for 9 as well. But as I mentioned, the Bruins, not much firepower up front. They weren't really expected to be a powerhouse as far as scoring on the power play is concerned. In fact, when the Bruins won their cup back in, I believe it was 2011, their power play was abysmal under Claude Julien. They still managed to win because of the goaltending of Tim Thomas, But by and large, the Bruins have not had a good power play in a few years. My opinion anyway. But when you look at it as a whole, the Bruins were at the bottom of the division last year. Are they going to make a significant step up? They may get better just a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be significant. Not enough to really contend against the Canadiens who, after what they've done in the summer, they should be much better than they were last season. And, especially given the fact that, there's going to be stability in goal. The defense, especially the top 4 and 5 guys, looks very solid. So I don't think there's a question that the competitiveness here between these two teams is going to be all that difficult. Where the Canadiens need to get better, obviously, is their power play percentage against the Bruins. They did a good job killing penalties. They need to do a better job putting pucks in the net. And so for the Canadiens to do that, obviously with 2 units as they're going to be this year, led by, of course, on the first unit, we believe it's going to be Slavkovsky, Laine, Caulfield, Demidov, and Hudson, just to name a few, but both units are going to be excessively powerful on the power play. The Canadiens should get the upper hand there. And if they can keep the same faceoff percentage, the days of Patrice Bergeron really screwing the Canadiens at the faceoff circle, those are done. So they still don't have much as far as strength at center ice. Zacha's decent, but, it is what it is. And whether or not Zacha's going to be there to start the season still remains to be seen, given the fact that they're not trying to get rid of him actively, but people are talking about if he's available and what the Bruins might want in exchange for him. Still remains to be seen, as is the case with Mittelstadt, but Mittelstadt's playing on the wing. So forget about Mittelstadt at this point. But that's it for the Bruins. I don't foresee them being a threat. I don't foresee them getting much better. They'll still be at the bottom tier of the conference, the division, I should say, and the conference anyway. But there's not going to be that significant a change this season. After next year's draft, after, Marco Sturm has gotten his mitts into the team, sees what he might want, and talks to Don Sweeney about those particular needs, then maybe the year after next will be the time to take a closer look at the Bruins. But right now, not really the case. Now, let's move on to the next team. That next team is the Buffalo Sabres. Now, the Sabres didn't really do much as far as signings either. They re-signed a bunch of players, including Ryan McLeod to a 4-year deal at $5 million per season. They re-signed Devin Levi to 2 years to extend his, entry level. He just got qualified. You've got Connor Timmins guy signing for 2 years. Bowen Byram signing for another 2 years at $6.25 million. Justin Danforth, Alex Lyon, and of course, as I mentioned, Jack Quinn. So not much as far as changes when the Sabres are concerned. But when you look at the Sabres as a whole, the Sabres themselves have spent the last few years trying to build. And they haven't really seen the success. Why? It's hard to say because, given the fact that they've got relatively good defense and young defense, the question, of course, is goaltending. That's kind of been stabilized a little bit. Levi still needs to be better. But, Pekka Luukkonen's got signed last year, and he provided some stability in goal for the Sabres, but not quite where they want to be. Then when you look at the transactions for the Sabres last season, they acquired Sam Lafferty. Chicago acquired Sam Lafferty, so the Sabres got rid of him. Then the Penguins acquired Connor Clifton from Buffalo, and Buffalo got Connor Timmins. And then the Utah Mammoth acquired Jason Peterko for Michael Kesselring and Josh Doan. Josh Doan, of course, being the son of Shane Doan. So it is what it is, right? So not much as far as changes for the Sabres are concerned. Not much as far as trying to take a solid step forward. So when you look at the Sabres as a whole, here's what they look like. Up front, you've got Benson, Norris, and Thompson. Zucker, Ryan McLeod, and Alex Tuck. Jack Quinn, Kulich, and Greenway. And then the fourth line is Mallinston, Krebs, and Danforth. On defense, Samuelson and Dahlin, Power and Kesselring, Byram and Timmins. And then, of course, in goal, you've got Luukkonen, who's the starter, and Leon, who's the backup, while Levi gets his legs under him. Up and down, again, just like the Bruins, the defense looks decent. The top four, Dahlin, Samuelsson, Power, and Kesselring, along with Byram, making it 5, they provide a good, solid base. And the one thing we do know is that Lindy Ruff is the defensive style coach. So he loves defensive players, right? He's not that overly offensive guy. Wasn't like that as a player. Certainly wasn't like that as a coach. And the one thing that he can do that a lot of other coaches in the league don't right now is develop players, right? We've seen it through Marty St. Louis and the Canadian staff, how players are developed in real time. And now I think the Sabres are trying to do the exact same thing where they're developing players at the NHL level, expecting those growing pains while still turning the team into a long-term contender. And when you take a look at their forwards, I mean, you've got Ryan McLeod, you've got Tage Thompson, Alex Tuch, Jack Quinn. There's some good pieces there. And I don't think the job's finished. I think the management in Buffalo, I forget what Kevin's last name is, so I apologize, their general manager. But we know that Terry Pagula, their owner, isn't shy about putting in some extra money into his team to make it better because he wants the team to succeed. He said that from the time he bought them, and he's talked about it time and time again. So where do the Sabres line up against the Montreal Canadiens? Well, last season, the Montreal Canadiens swept the Sabres 3-0-1, winning one game in overtime back on March 3rd when they played back-to-backs on the 1st and the 3rd. Their first game was against them in November, their second in December, and then, of course, as I mentioned, those 2 games in March. Canadiens in the face-off dot, 51.4% against the Sabres, so that's better than 50%. And the big difference between where the Sabres were and the Canadiens were was, of course, as I mentioned, goaltending. The Canadiens' goaltending, despite the fact being sub-900 against the Sabres, they were at 879 against the Buffalo Sabres. The Sabres' goals against was below 800 at 799. So you can tell right there that that's the difference. The fact that the Sabres goaltending was absolutely putrid against the Canadiens last year, that speaks volumes as far as, how competitive the Sabres were last season. You look at the Sabres power play. The Sabres power play against Montreal in 4 games was 1 for 15, while the Canadiens were 8 for 21. That's good for 38.1%. Well above where they ended up at the end of the season league-wise. But, let me see here. If I look at their power play at the end of the season, give me one sec. Where were we? At the end of the season, they were at 21.6%. So 17 points higher against the Buffalo Sabres. It's expected against the Sabres because, as I mentioned, their goaltending wasn't nearly where it needed to be last year. Devin Levi played a couple of games against the Canadiens and looked good early in the season, which is why he got sent down to Rochester. So, that's just par for the course. Levi is going to continue to season in the American Hockey League. Should have a better season this year, starting there and having his confidence. We'll see how that goes. But Pekka Luukkonen is going to have to shoulder the load for the Buffalo Sabres in goal. And then, of course, there's their defense, as I mentioned. Their defense, a hell of a lot better than it was last year. One thing that we have to keep an eye on is Rasmus Dahlin. Because if there's one thing Dahlin does as the captain of the Sabres, is he sets a poor example as far as discipline is concerned. Last year, he took a lot of penalties against the Montreal Canadiens. Why? I don't really know. But he was overly aggressive at certain points against Montreal, especially in his own zone, and that cost the Sabres dearly. When you allow 8 goals on 21 power play opportunities, there's not much as far as wiggle room there when your team's concerned. If you look at the 4 games, the Canadiens were pretty even throughout. 2 for 6 in game 1, 3 for 6, 50% in game 2, 1 for 4 in game 3, and then 2 for 5 in game 4. So it was 33.3%, 50, 25, and 40. So that's where the Sabres can get better. A little bit more discipline, staying out of the box and playing it 5-on-5. They were good 5-on-5 against the Canadiens. Still, the Canadiens won all 4 meetings against the Sabres. Do I think that's going to happen again? If there's one thing I know about Buffalo over the years, never expect the expected. Whether it was when Jeff Skinner was on the team or whether it was back in the 80s when Lindy Ruff was on the team, you name it, the Sabres, or especially when Pat LaFontaine was there, the Sabres always found a way to be a thorn in the Canadiens' ass during the regular season. I don't think that's going to be the case as much as it normally is for the Sabres. But early in the season, the Sabres will struggle a little bit. As the season progresses and the guys get comfortable with each other, I think that's going to change. And I think the Sabres may very well be a much more difficult out in the second half of the season as opposed to the first. Will they be great? Absolutely not. And I think really, just like I mentioned with Boston, the Sabres are going to want to go out and get that last, that first overall pick and try to get Connor McKenna. But I don't think they're going to try to tank on purpose. They've had enough seasons of losing in Buffalo. It's not like the Bruins, who it's a couple of seasons now that they've really struggled, especially last season. Buffalo, it's been a few years that, they have not been anywhere near where they need to be. They've gotten their first round picks in Owen Power. And Byram. They can move ahead now after having built a solid D, as I mentioned, just like the Canadiens. Teams are using that same philosophy, building their defense, giving them, especially Buffalo, giving them a chance to develop at the National Hockey League level, making them better, and then allowing their forward group to catch up and be more competitive. So I don't foresee Buffalo again being too competitive this year, just like the Bruins, maybe the year after next. But these two teams, Buffalo and Boston, I foresee them both being near the bottom of the Atlantic once again, maybe even the conference. But it's really not something I look forward to. Historically, right, back when I was growing up, the Bruins and Buffalo, along with the New York Rangers and, of course, the Quebec Nordiques back in the day, were the 4 rivals I look forward to most against the Canadiens. Now, of course, the Nordiques have come and gone. It wasn't even the Leafs back then because the Leafs were an afterthought. Now the Leafs are more of a rival than they were back then, just like the Ottawa Senators. But I always look forward to Boston and Buffalo games because it was always nitty-gritty, whether they were playing at the Old Odd or the Boston Garden or the Montreal Forum. There was an atmosphere that those teams played against each other that just isn't there anymore. I wish it were. I wish you guys could feel that rivalry, because those games, especially back in the 70s where, on Boston you had Wayne Cashman, Terry O'Reilly, Don Marcotte, who was the other one? Jean Rattel, Jerry Cheevers in goal. You had Brad Park on defense along with Mike Milbury. A rough and tumble Bruins team. And then for the Sabres, you had the French Connection, right? Led by Gilbert Perreault, and you had good goaltending, whether it was Bob Sauvé or I'd be remiss to remember the other goaltenders. It's been so long. But there were always good teams in Buffalo, and you had good players, as I mentioned. You had the likes of Pat LaFontaine at a certain point. You had Jeff Skinner later on. You had, Lindy Ruff. We all hated Lindy Ruff because it was such a tough guy to play against. But you get what I mean. Those are the rivalries I want to see. That's where I want to see these teams get to. And it's not even a question of, do I think Montreal is going to get into the playoffs or not? This year, I think they will, right? Overall, I think they're getting into there. I don't think they'll be in a wild card position. I honestly think the Canadiens may very well end up at the top of the division. That remains to be seen. But overall, I like rivalry games. I like real rivalries, not these new ones like the Leafs or the Ottawa Senators, but the old ones. Bruins, even Philly for that matter, in the Metropolitan Division. We hated playing Philadelphia because it was always a tough out, right? So those are the rivalries I look forward to. So I want Buffalo and Boston to be good. I want them to give the Canadiens fits, because after all, the better the competition, the better the Montreal Canadiens play. Next time, we'll be talking about Detroit and those pesky Ottawa Senators.